this point, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Don Foster, who will chair the next part of the proceedings. Don,
thank you very much indeed, and welcome everybody. We're going to discuss the 1992 general election, when 5 new members, or 1 retread included in that, came up to Westminster. I'm delighted that 2 of them, Nick Harvey and Paul Tyler, are actually on this chat, and so we might hear from them a bit later on. But it's worth remembering that the 92 election, one of the longest in living memory, was fought at a time when we were in the grip of the deepest recession since the Second World War, with concerns about education, the poll tax, and of course the beginnings of splits within the Conservatives over Europe. It was the first election contested by the Liberal Democrats, formed from the merger, as you know, between the Liberal Party and the SDP just 4 years before. And we entered the contest buoyed by parliamentary by-election victories, impressive local election results in 1991, and a very high popularity of our leader at the time, Paddy Ashdown. On the other hand, the opinion polls looked bleak for the Tories, who knew that since the Napoleonic War, no party had been returned to power for a 4th consecutive time, which is why Andrew Rawnsley suggested that a future quiz question should be: Paddy Ashdown won the campaign, Neil Kinnock won the polls, but John Major won in the end. Explain. So here to give their answers are Alison Holmes and Dennis Kavanagh. I'll introduce them both in a minute. Each are going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions and comments from the audience. So can I ask you please to just make sure you're muted unless you're speaking. Can you put any suggested questions that you want to raise in the chat, and you can do that from the start off. At any point you want to, just put them in the chat, and then we'll come to them a bit later on. Now, our first speaker is Alison Holmes, Dr. Alison Holmes. Now, she was the party's national campaign coordinator for the 92 and then subsequently the 97 general election. She then went on to work for the BBC in public relations, headed up the London office of the largest UK-US business membership organisation, and she's currently a professor in the Department of Politics at the Humboldt State University in Arcata in California. So looking forward very much to hearing what Alison's got to say. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Don. I hope you can all hear me all right. A couple of nods would be good if everybody can. Good, thank you. And yes, I am basically in Arcata, California, which is, I usually tell people to go to the Oregon border and spit south. That's how far north in California I am. But it's an honor to be with you, albeit virtually. And I'm grateful that Zoom can overcome 5,000 miles and the Omicron variant. Though I vividly recall when we groaned if a spokesperson had to be down the line. How quaint that sounds to us all now. But many thanks to the Liberal Democrat History Group and to you, Don. It's great to see you here. Obviously a big campaign for you, so I hope you and all of the other faces I see here will share. I'm so impressed with this group. Actually, I'd also like to start by taking a moment to remember absent friends. Of course, Paddy, the heart and soul of the 92 campaign, and Richard Home, who led the 92 manifesto. But as I went through old clippings and campaign memos, I started to jot down the names and sadly watched it grow longer. A noble list of old friends, but their spirit carries on. 2 absent friends. Of course, among the living, but missing nonetheless, is Des Wilson. When asked to do this, I did some quick sums and realized Des turned 80 last year. And this year also marks my 40th high school reunion. So I did some quick reckoning, and turns out Des was about 50 and I was 26. For the first time, it suddenly occurred to me, what crazy person allowed this 26-year-old Yank, who'd only been in the country less than 3 years, anywhere near this thing? Clearly, the party was very desperate at the time. But it's great to see familiar faces, and even though that does make this a bit daunting. As a professor, I often talk to audiences with no clue, but I'm sure folks here have studied this campaign, the stats, the candidates, the local election results for the last 50 years, so I surrender on all that from the outset. Instead, perhaps in honor of Des, or to spite him, I will take a page from his book, Battle for Power, about the 1987 campaign, and become an inside outsider, offering impressions and an overview from Cowley Street during the 1992 campaign. There are three big themes or ideas that animated the campaign, and each one had both strategic and practical implications. Don mentioned a few of them, but first, it was really just an amazing time to be alive. Foreign affairs were literally on fire and reaching deep into domestic politics. There was a new zeitgeist at the end of the 80s, and it provided a dramatic backdrop and gave a sense of hope and even destiny to everything we did. Second, there was a continual paradox of fighting the last war through the skirmishes of the current one. 1987 weighed heavily on all the key players, staff and politicians alike. Third, and perhaps the most pervasive factor, was the impact of technology on every level of campaigning. We were living through a seismic shift in how campaigns work. But what was on our radar looking towards the campaign? Again, Don mentioned some of them, but we all know the headlines. Though it's important, I think, to remember what it felt like looking into that abyss. The 87 campaign was awful and left a bloody merger negotiation complete with a dead parrot in its wake. The Social and Liberal Democrats, or SLD, came screaming into being in March 1988. Paddy became leader in July, inheriting a bankrupt party. The general secretary was gone, while the name, almost instantly hated by party faithful and the immediate butt of public jokes, was changed for the first time to the Democrats at the fall conference. Quite a start. 1 year later, the party was at 4% for 3 consecutive Maury polls, or as Tim Clement-Jones would remind us, within the margin of error of not existing. We got 6% in the June 1989 European elections, behind the Greens at 15%. If you had a checklist for the rock bottom of politics, we were ticking a lot of the boxes. On the upside, the party managed 19% in the 1989 local elections, but controlled only the Isle of Wight. The name was changed again to the Liberal Democrats at that fall conference. But the real glimmer was the 2 by-election coups, Eastbourne in 1990 and another in Ribble Valley in 91. Returning to the first of those 3 themes, the world was literally exploding. There was Lockerbie and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Further afield, the protests in Tiananmen Square and the invasion of Kuwait. Everything seemed in turmoil, but liberals around the world saw hope for a progressive, even radical shift in politics. That global tone colored Paddy's style and the party's positioning, and really the entire mood of our campaign. Back at Cowley Street, Des was appointed to run the campaign in February 1990 for a date still unknown. And I had been working in Paddy's office with the 1991 group, a secret collection of the great and good shared by Alec McGibbon. This evolved into my general election job in December 1990. So together with Ann Paynton, the core election team was wobbly, but we were off. Which brings me to the second theme. Every campaign, like every war, tends to refight the last battle, and this was no exception. But perhaps it was a good thing that we had no documentation of 87. I never knew if it had been taken away or if Chris Renard had a stash in the campaign's office, but the general election team had nothing. So I arrived young and fresh, totally ignorant of who had sided with who in the merger trenches, but equally important, innocent of any political crimes. That was very handy, as reconnaissance was my first job. We reached out to the candidates from 1987 and got some pretty salty replies, while Andrew Duff and Sarah Ludford did a mop-up of the Euros, so you can add some vinegar to that salt. From the outset, 3 things drove Des. First, above all, loyalty to Paddy. Second was a sense of responsibility and even embarrassment about 1987. I don't think that anyone believes that the 2 Davids could have been controlled or mitigated, but I think Des felt some guilt as the chair of the election committee. But underlying it all was the irresistible thrill of a campaign, made abundantly clear in Des's love of writing campaign battle plans at the drop of a hat, but always with a dash of surprise. I'll try and do my share screen here and show you what he really enjoyed. If she can do this correctly. So from the very first document, there were 3 objectives. Number 1, survival, which frankly also felt like they should probably be objectives 2 and 3. But the other 2 constantly repeated goals were build for the future and 20% of the vote, 20 seats. Des Wilson is many things, but unfocused is not one of them. Every single thing we did had to pass the test of whether or not it supported one, if not all, those objectives. The watchword was developmental, and we meant it. From the top to the bottom, from the fast start and the Ashdown challenge to the final week plan and the polling day +1 plan. As to the previous war, we were either building on 87 or recovering from 87, which can be seen in a number of structural features. The best example is probably the night team, an 87 innovation, but with the launch of Sky News, yes, the launch of Sky News, in 1989, the relationship between newspapers and television on campaign coverage had changed forever. Thus, the 9 team also became the 24/7 news monitoring team, complete with ubiquitous stopwatches. During 87, Des literally worked with the night team, only possible because he could sleep while the leaders were on the road and because broadcasters and papers had their own afternoon lull. By 92, technology had fundamentally altered the pace and feel of the campaign day. But thanks to that core operation and ahead of the other parties, we were able to shift straight into a 24/7 mode. This turned out to be crucial because broadcasters were keen to use our poll rating to drop us wherever possible. But our monitoring gave us the hard data to use as ammunition to protect our share, a point Des hammered hard and as often as possible. Also building on 87 were the innovations of regional media coordinators who this time were recruited much earlier and trained. And we continued the Scottish and Welsh liaisons, bringing them inside the core team, primarily so Des wouldn't have to take any flack. Innovations particular to 92 included the assignment of a level to every seat, targeted, developmental, etc., and initiatives around diversity, accessibility, and support for women candidates. All kind of radical ideas looking back now. In terms of recovery from 87, the painfully public squabbles led us to ensure that the party's issues were all locked down well in advance of the campaign, while the nascent targeting strategy became integrated into the promotion of the policy platform for the first time. Des would say you should not try and sell something nationally if consumers can't get it on the shelves locally. This idea was the foundation not only of the press conference packages, or what we called boxes, and inside each literal box was a policy summary, an attack on the other parties, a press statement, a list of photo ops, experts and contacts, but also the mini campaigns on the key issues, or the famous 5 E's: education, environment, economy, Europe, and electoral reform. These were all rolled out with supporting material for leaflets, including logos and artwork to local councillors and candidates, via 3-inch floppy disks, multi-faxes, and pagers, if you can remember those. So these message boxes and mini campaigns helped us recover our platform credibility, but they were also in response to the third and much larger trend. As I say, 24-hour news was now a part of the media environment, and all kinds of technology was rapidly changing our ability and journalists' ability to communicate quickly. We had to get better at being consistent. But I would argue that technology really just put a spotlight on the underlying change, which was the professionalization, or what some call the Americanization, of political campaigning. This was the dawn of the packaged image era. During the campaign, this was called the issue of glitz and glamour, or glitz versus content, or what some in the Labour Party were calling T-shirt socialism. And many commentators at the time and after have argued that the media campaign was a campaign of their own making, or even that the coverage of the campaign was the campaign. And there is some truth to this. Looking back at the press clippings, the fall of Maggie created a huge gap, not only for the Conservatives, but for how others could position themselves. And it put immense pressure on John Major. Paddy was dealing with a bumpy new party and was also untested in the campaign hot seat. Only Neil Kinnock had any form, and it wasn't that great. Everyone had everything on the line, personally and politically. So it is hardly surprising that all three parties spent a lot of time and money creating what they hoped was a coherent image of their leaders and, if possible, their parties. The Labour Party ditched the red flag for the rose. They started a major policy review, and Peter Mandelson began to practice his dark arts in Millbank. The Tories shifted from the squat flame to the first torch and focused all their effort on shifting from Maggie the hectoring to John the affable. All three parties did a movie version of a leader election broadcast and created a special road event. Major had his soapbox and the Meet the Major events, Paddy's challenge tour to kick off the campaign, and who can forget the trip to Boulogne? While Kinnock, having fended off attacks that he had been sheltered throughout the campaign, stumbled at the end in their biggest, glitziest set piece, the Sheffield Rally, which quickly came to symbolize the Welsh boyo who could not be trusted. Speaking of election broadcasts, the party's professionalization in advertising and PR deserves a mention. Our creative teams came through with award-winning posters sent around the country on vans for the very first time, and our broadcasts had come a long way since Rosie's Rabbit. The party had contracted with Smith & Watson and been filming for nearly 2 years, a process that paid off well before the election. For example, our local election broadcast in '91 got 14 million viewers, more than Neighbours. Tories got 13 million and Labour only 11.5, which proved to be a trend as shown in yet another new media gimmick of people metering. That was basically live focus groups watching party broadcasts and giving instant responses. This was designed as late night TV for the politically addicted, but it often offered evidence that Paddy really did connect with people better than the other leaders. A thought that spread from late night TV to daily news and opinion pieces, and finally to party mantra. As Richard Home used to say, if you have no money, you have to think twice as hard. Of course, it also helps when others stumble, as was the case of the Battle of Jennifer's Ear, the Labour broadcast about an NHS case that turned into a family soap opera as her relatives, who all turned out to be Tories, came forward to dispute their broadcast. As for content, I'll see if I can do another screen share without messing up. Few can compete with the fascination Lib Dems have for policy. Post-election chatter argued we were peripheral, but we were consistently launching substantive material, beginning with Shaping Tomorrow, Starting Today, and then Changing Britain for Good, a prelude to the manifesto. But basically, when the threat of a 1991 election was gone, a January to May group was formed to combine the extra manpower of the election team with the party's day-to-day staff, a process that was not without its hiccups, but that effectively drove the agenda, kicking off in January of '91 with the My Vote logo, a controversial idea that merits a detour. Born in the recover from mode, the hung parliament scenario became the ghost of '87, haunting interviews, press conferences, and the party conference. The result was an official policy of equidistance, but with the departure of Thatcher, it had come under increasing pressure by September of '91. The polls all pointed to the possibility of a hung parliament, and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the spirit of Eastern Europe ironically put electoral reform on the whole world's agenda. Des's reply, as with everything else, was to tackle it head on. From the start, he wanted to campaign on the basis that all votes are wasted in the current system, but votes could be powerful. Des wanted to convey the idea that my vote is a vote for something, not just against something. The sentiment seemed to resonate, but many in the party were unhappy that the hung parliament ghost had effectively been given a voice, including in the final election broadcast. The pundits had called the result wrong, and we followed them down a rabbit hole. On the other hand, the topic was literally being covered wall to wall. How could we not address it? So from January '92, the party was in full phony war election mode. The Bird of Liberty was relaunched in March '92 with the First Steps document. And as I said, all these issue presentation materials were linked to mini campaigns on the ground. One thing I've not explicitly mentioned, but Don alluded to, is the fact that this was the longest ever peacetime parliament. If the parties and the media packaged and repackaged material, the sheer length of the campaign has to be considered a major factor. The manifesto launches and even the budgets were simply not as newsworthy because everyone had already launched them, probably about 3 times. Of course, some things were definitely not in the plan, and we all remember Paddy's acknowledgement of his affair in February of 1992. But as horrific as it was, waiting for Sunday paper deadlines to pass and legal threats, it was ultimately supported the theory that people liked and still trusted Paddy. Des certainly argued that case in support of the plan to come clean before the papers could out him, which was ultimately what we did. And as we know, Paddy Pantsdown survived to fight not only another day, but for many years to come. Some have called 1992 a myth-making election. I'm not sure about that, but it marked a huge shift in electioneering in the UK and set the fundamental groundwork for the Lib Dem result in 1997. Historian Eric Hobsbawm talks about the long 19th century and argues that we often try to separate events that are more accurately seen as related parts of deeper trends. I know we're here to mark the 30th anniversary of 1992, and maybe I'm biased because I was heavily involved in both the 92 and the 97 elections, but I think they are yin and yang, Gemini twins, whatever you want to call it, but they are locked together as 2 parts of the same phase of the party's history and development. The disastrous 87 campaign was the break in the chain of history, and many people I contacted in those early days simply did not want to know. They were angry and disillusioned with both parties, all parties. But in some senses, I think that freed the Liberals to move away from their past to a different approach and style, and even a different policy platform, but in a credible way. The break made room for a radical and professional party of the center left, and natural space for the merger of Social Democrats and Liberals. This makes the real legacy of what we were doing in 1992, even if we were too busy trying to survive, to see it, the creation of a framework, a shape, a mode of operating, and a baseline starting point for the party that could survive. The 92 campaign not only had to convince the world that the Liberal Democrats deserved to exist, but to convince our own supporters that it was worth carrying on. A lot of people accused Des of being dictatorial in his style and too focused on his own recognition and power. Certainly, Alison Smith of the FT gets the prize for understatement when she observed in 1991 that Des was, quote, less than a twin soul to Richard Home, end quote. But one of Des's biggest complaints was also his deepest fear, that we not, quote, blow it like we blew it last time. That fear drove him to hone in on 2 things, survival and development. We did both. With little money and almost entirely on the backs of volunteers, we ran a clear and professional campaign, turned in a solid result. We brought in Don Foster after all, but really to lay the foundation of the party and campaigning structures that made 1997 our best results since 1906 and that brought down the Tories remotely possible. Paddy loved his quotes, and one he often used was, "Give me a fulcrum and a place to stand and I can change the world." The legacy of the 1992 campaign was essentially that it gave Paddy and the party a place to stand. Thank you.
Alison, thank you very, very much indeed. And I'm sure that will spawn a large number of questions. Remember, please put them in the chat. I mentioned earlier that Nick Harvey's with us and Paul Tyler, 2 of the winners in that 92 election. I'm delighted to say that I see that we've also now got David Steele and Simon Hughes. So welcome to both of them. But I'm sure, and I've noted incidentally a request already for an opportunity to read what Alison had said. So I'm sure, Alison, you can send that to us and we can circulate it through the good offices of the Lib Dem History Group. Now we turn to our second speaker, Dennis Kavanagh. Now, Dennis is a Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Liverpool, written extensively about post-war British politics, Thatcherism, political behaviour. He's been involved in every Palgrave-Macmillan election study between 1974 and 2017, and he was the co-author of The British General Election of 1992. So a lot to tell us. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope people can hear me, even if they can't see me very well. Duncan has been trying to help me a great deal. Can people hear me? Can I be heard? Yes. Okay.
Yes, you
Thanks.
can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Thank
you
you. Let me carry on. Okay. Jolly good. I'd like to thank Duncan. I'd like to thank Neil for inviting me, and I recognise some of the names that used to help me a great deal when I was writing elections. I should mention that my co-author in all of those books, apart from the more recent ones, was David Butler, who's now 97 and is still alive and interested in things. Alison's talk was fascinating, a real insider account, very insightful, and I found nothing really to disagree with it. But let me try and, seeing that she's talked about the Lib Dems, let me talk really more generally, if I can. Thinking back some 30 years, back to 1992 election, what strikes me most about the election and the outcome is this. General elections are supposed to set the scene for what follows. Nothing could have been further from the truth after the 1992 general election. Everything turned out the opposite from what might have been expected the day after the results were known. The optimist, John Major, the happy person, ended up destroyed by 1997. Paddy, disappointed, went on to strengths in the Parliament and in the general election. And Neil Kinnock, who had been measuring the curtains, so I'm told, by somebody who had dinner with him a couple of days before the general election, of course, was crushed and resigned. Let me begin with a couple of introductory remarks about elections. The first is this. 1992, I think Don raised the question about whether the Conservatives would set a record by winning a fourth consecutive general election. The thing to remember, so was it going to be the continuation, the confirmation of a Conservative success, or would it be time for change? What I want to say, and what I always emphasize to students, is change is rather rare in British general elections. If you think about 51 to 64, 79 to 97, 97 to 2010, 2010 until, if the Parliament lasts to 2024, we have long periods of one-party government. Change is very rare. When the pendulum swings, it swings very slowly and pretty rarely, actually. So change is unusual. Confirmation is the normal thing in British politics. But by 1992, there had been changes. Let me just go through them. Labour, as Alison pointed out, it had its policy review. It had inched, or maybe more than inched, more in the direction of what Thatcher had done over the previous years, and it had abandoned unilateral disarmament. It was clearly moving towards the centre, perhaps trespassing upon liberal democratic territory. Second, look at the Conservatives. The Conservatives made the crucial change. They dumped Margaret Thatcher and brought in John Major. That changed the mood tremendously, changed the opinion polls tremendously, changed the image of the Conservative Party greatly. And of course, Major's great achievement was to dump the poll tax. And the other thing is that, again, Don mentioned about Britain being in the middle of a very bitter recession. When people were asked during the general election who they blamed for the general election, something like nearly half blamed Thatcher. Only 4% blamed John Major. So the Conservatives really, they could present themselves as the new party, the party of change, change from Thatcher. Okay, and then there were the Lib Dems. Well, again, as Alison has made the point about the impact of Des Wilson, the great achievement that the Lib Dems had done going into the election was that they had formed themselves into a single party, had got rid of the dual leadership and the two-party system, the two-party alliance. It was back to the old things. the third thing I want to say, just by way of introduction, is the Liberals' terrific comeback that Alison has mentioned. Only by March 91 did they begin consistently to score double figures in opinion polls. There was, of course, two significant by-election successes. Eastbourne, which Renard, I think Chris Renard, I don't know whether he's with us tonight, had to persuade a reluctant Paddy Ashdown to fight because he didn't want to, out of respect for Ian Gow, who'd been assassinated. They won that, and also the Ribble Valley. But the problem of the Lib Dems then and of Renardism was, how can you translate or transform the by-election episodic victories into a more a more long-lasting, more persuasive narrative that can paint across a broader canvas. So how could they break out that? Now, what did Paddy think? Well, two things are worth thinking about Paddy. I think in his diaries, he says in January of 92, he had a conversation with Roy Jenkins about what he would do in the event of being made an offer to join a coalition or something. And he was going to ask for 4 cabinet posts. And they could discuss what kind of posts they would be. But at the same time, he hedged his bets because he had written his charred speech anticipating a Conservative victory and a humiliation for Labour, a humiliation that would simply be a 4th election defeat, never mind the scale of the election defeat. He was all, in other words, he was planning both things. Now, Alison has talked about the campaign, so I don't want to talk, I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Let me just mention a couple of things that I think are worth adding. The first is, this was a dreadful election for the opinion pollsters, the Waterloo of the polls, who were forecasting throughout a hung parliament or even a Labour victory. They were wrong, and it wasn't to do with a last-minute change of voting. They'd been under-sampling Conservative voters or people with likely Conservative voting intentions throughout the election campaign, and they changed their polling methods after 1992. Secondly, it wasn't the Sun what won it, because a third of Sun readers were voting Labour anyway, and there was no more bigger switch among Sun readers than there were among other people. And the third important thing about why the polls were wrong is, if you looked at the data about growing economic optimism, which was rising during the campaign, and which was the more economically competent party, that support for the Conservatives was growing throughout. So the indicators were there that the polls about voting intentions weren't doing justice to the strength of the Conservative side. The other points I'd like to make is, that wasn't mentioned, was tax. John Smith's shadow budget, which was, given in a very formal way. I don't know whether he sipped whiskey during it, but this was the proper chancellor. It wasn't an amateur thing, it was very, very professional. This, with its talk of increase in taxes, worried a number of people, not least the people who would be at the forefront of New Labour in the next few years. They doubted the wisdom of it, even at the time. And I remember Philip Gould telling me he had a most embarrassing confrontation with John Smith when Philip warned him against what he was doing. But something like nearly a half of voters during the election mentioned their fear of tax rises under Labour. And this was, of course, played up for all it's worth by the Conservative press. I think most pundits now would regard the 92 election as a pocket vote election, and that's why Labour lost and the Conservatives won. The other thing that I don't think helped the Lib Dems was the fear of a hung parliament. People had no experience of coalition government in the UK, and I think there was worry about the uncertainty that a hung parliament would bring. And the other thing that's worth adding to that is the fear of Neil Kinnock. Neil Kinnock was the Trojan horse that the Conservative press and the Conservative leaders more quietly raised, just like they raised Michael Foot in 1983 and they raised Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. If you vote Liberal or Lib Dem, there is the danger of giving the keys to number 10 Downing Street to A, B and C, which is a traditional, which is a real familiar Conservative appeal. And I think the last thing I'd just like to say on this is about Paddy's campaigning style. It was very presidential. Neil Kinnock knew he wasn't an asset, and he played the team. He gave a prominent role to John Smith and others. John Major, of course, was going around on his soapbox. The boy from Brixton. Paddy was presidential, and it suited him. He carried off the part very well. And when the pollsters did surveys of ratings of leader, Paddy outscored the other two tremendously. So he was a real asset to a greater extent than was Kinnock was a minus for Labour, but I mean Paddy was a real plus for the Lib Dems. Unfortunately, there were no leader debates in 1992. I wonder what would have happened to Lib Dem ratings if there had been debates then. But the approval, if he was acting presidentially, perfectly understandable reasons, people weren't voting on presidential lines. It didn't carry over to voting for the party. And the other thing that ran right throughout the campaign, of course, is the old problem for any third party that Alison's talked about, dealing with the wasted vote argument. Secondly, if the election is going to be close, which of the other two parties are you going to cuddle up to? And that gets them into trouble. Right, now, if I've got a few minutes, let me just say a couple of things about the results, and then I want to talk about what I think the significance of the election may have been. First thing is the electoral system. The Conservatives got smashed by the electoral system. They had an 8% lead in the vote, but only a majority that wasn't going to last for full parliament, 21 seats. Just an extra 0.5% swing against the Conservatives, and they'd have been deprived of their parliamentary majority. So, I mean, if ever they were going to think about proportional representation, that would have been the result, a result that would convince them. Secondly, about the Lib Dems, Alison's talked about Des's 3 targets, and they were achieved. Great achievement, no doubt. Concentration of resources worked. They got the same percentage of the vote as they had in October 74, but compared to 13 seats then, they got 20 seats this time. Russell Johnson, I think, was elected with 26% of the vote in Inverness. They also gained a little bit by tactical voting, but Labour made more. You can point to seats like Bath, to Cheltenham and Devon North, where the Lib Dems gained from tactical voting, but Labour did even better. They had big swings in Conservative Labour marginals by squeezing the Lib Dems, who were in third place. Looking ahead, the real tactical voting success was in 1997, where the party got, according to Michael Steed and John Curtis, probably got between 10 and 14 seats as a result of tactical voting away from Labour. They got 46 seats then. Now that was when they could really have played the game, because the 46 seats would have been pretty significant in the 1922 election. Now let me just tie this up with some thoughts. And my thoughts are this, really. The Conservative victory was the 4th time they'd beaten Labour by 7% or more. That was the first time that had happened. They were more than ever, the Conservatives were the normal party of government. We sometimes, Britain flirts through most of its 20th century history with being one dominant party government rather than a competitive two-party government, or maybe multi-partisan. But the people who didn't feel that were Chris Patten, who was obviously chastened and was thinking ahead about other things. I talked to him a couple of days afterwards, actually. Sorry, I'm about to digress, but I won't about the conversation. And John Major, and a few days afterwards, they'd seen the papers about what the economy was doing and so on, and they knew there was going to be trouble ahead. This was before they'd even penciled in what was going to happen over Maastricht. It so happened that the normal party of government was about to implode. They were going to be out of government for a generation. The 13 years they began in opposition, 1997 to 20, was the longest period they'd been out of office for over 100 years. And of course, what that began is the shift in a Euro skeptic direction when they were in opposition. Labour, as I say, it was a disaster. And I can remember when I was an undergraduate, the book we always used to read after the 1959 election result was Must Labour Lose by Abrams and Rose. Some of the older chaps may remember it. But since then, we've had other books like Can Labour Win? I mean, Labour goes through these bouts of winning a succession of elections very, very badly, and it's kind of written off. The Sunday Times, the day after the election results were all in, finally said socialism, RIP. And I have to say, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Philip Gould, and all those people were in despair. And that despair carried on because John Smith didn't seem to be, in their eyes, facing up to the need for radical change. John Smith seemed to be buying in to the idea of just one more push and we can do it. One of the ifs of recent history is, what if Labour, aided by the Lib Dems in one form or another, confidence and supply motion or coalition, what if they'd actually formed the government after 1992? What a disaster that would have been. It would have confirmed all the Conservative warnings about coalitions are bad, that tax rises were inevitable, would show that you can't trust Labour. So 1992 was a terrible election to win. So it was a blessing in disguise for the Liberal Democrats who built on it and for Labour. But Labour's real breakthrough came when Blair replaced Tony Major. So immediately afterwards, neither the two main parties had strategies for the immediate future. The one party that did, or the one leader that did, was Paddy Ashdown with his charred speech, because he thought that the fourth consecutive election defeat for Labour was clearly a challenge for Labour. What was it going to do about it? And of course, we know what happened in the next few days, the next few years, and I don't want to go through with them. But the party that faced up the most to the 1992 election result, stroke defeat, I think, were the Lib Dems under Paddy Ashdown. Can I just draw, going to try your patience, looking further ahead. Looking further ahead, and I'm looking 20, 30 years ago, what do you think about looking back at 1992, a different world? The first thing you see is the coalitions worked. The 2010 coalition worked. You know, as a coherent government, it worked. And of course, you've got the experience of Scotland and Wales, where devolution has worked. So in a sense, it's no longer the kind of novelty that it would have been in 1992. And if the open question is whether, if Blair had to, would he have formed a coalition with Paddy in 1997 if he'd needed to? And I suppose the second thing, which is rather sobering for the Lib Dems, is the Lib Dems, of course, want three-party politics. What's happened to British politics now is multi-party politics. That the space that they had in the centre, they now have to share. They've had to share with right-wing parties, the breakthrough of UKIP, and they've had to share with SNP. Very interesting. Of the 20 seats that the Lib Dems got in 1992, 9, virtually half, were in Scotland. And this Scottish dimension is so important because since after Joe Drummond, four of the next leaders were from Scotland. But that's Scotland and British politics is another thing altogether. So I think the other problem that faces the Lib Dems now that wasn't present then is, of course, what's happened because of Brexit and the tribal politics that has generated and the identity politics that has generated. Anyway, I'm doing all over the way. Thank you very much.
Dennis, thank you very much indeed. Some fascinating insights there. We're very grateful for them. Not least, as picked up by people in the chat, the whole issue of fear of the so-called Labour tax bombshell, fear of the potential for the unknown of a hung parliament and so on. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to call on Duncan Brack in a second to just say a few quick words about the Liberal Democrat History Group itself, and then we'll move into any questions people might have. Again, can I just remind you, can you please put them on the chat? And I'm going to ask Paul Tyler to stand by in good old Liberal Assembly and now Liberal Democrat conference mode. And then I'm going to invite him and then Nick Harvey to say a few quick words, and then we'll move into questions from the floor. So over to Duncan.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for chairing this meeting. I just want to say a few words about the Liberal Democrat History Group for those of you on the meeting who are not familiar with us. Apologies to those of you who are. I think we have quite a few new people this evening. We were founded when this party was set up in 1988 to promote discussion and research of the history of the party and its predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SDP. And we do this in 4 main ways. We organise meetings like this one. I can tell you that our next meeting will be a fringe meeting at the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference on working with Labour. This time looking right back to 1923 to 31, so the 2 periods during which Labour was in minority government, and examining the dilemmas and the choices that the Liberal Party made in response. That's on the Friday of Spring Conference, the 11th of March, but you do have to be registered for the conference to be able to attend. Obviously, that's an online meeting, as the conference itself is online. And then we'll organise a meeting in the summer, and we really hope that this one will be a real-life one, hopefully with a hybrid option, being able to log in from elsewhere as well. But we hope it will be able to return to the National Liberal Club with a topic in the summer, and then we will look forward to fringe meeting at the autumn Liberal Democrat conference. Second thing we do is publish the Journal of Liberal History. This is the latest issue, just hot off the press. Our leader is on corruption unmasked, as you can see, but because we're the history group, it's not about 2022 and PPE contracts. It's about the publication that came out in 1820 and the impact it had on politics there. We publish 4 issues a year with articles, book reviews, meeting reports. There'll be a report of this meeting in due course. Third thing we do is publish a range of reference books and shorter booklets, which are all available on our website. And the fourth thing is that we maintain a range of resources for students of liberal history on the website, www.liberalhistory.org.uk. Subscription to the journal costs only £25 a year or £15 for unwaged. And Tony, if you're in the AGM, talked a bit about the plans we have for making it more accessible in an online version in the future. So I hope you, if you aren't subscribers at the moment, you have a look at our website and hopefully decide to subscribe. And those of you who are subscribers, some of you will need to renew, and you can do that most easily through our website. And we are very grateful for any support you can give us. Thanks very much. Don, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan. Basically, the message is very simple. If you're not a member, sign up and do so quickly. Go onto the website and have a look. My own reflections of the 92 election, 2 key ones, was that I had 3, because we were always told everything had to be done in 3s. I had 3 campaign messages in all of my literature. The first was Labour cannot win here in Bath. My second was Labour cannot win, and my third was Labour cannot win. But as somebody's rightly pointed out in the chat, the whole idea of tactical voting, which helped me enormously in 92 in Bath, came much more to the fore in 97. And it may be that Dennis and Alison may want to comment on tactical voting in a second. The other thing, just for a bit of light-hearted relief before we go into more serious questions and comments, was that the 92 election in Bath was covered by a reporter from an American travel magazine called Travel Holiday. And I just thought for fun, I'd read you 2 extracts from the 14-page article he wrote about it. He says this: "It was evidently not going to be easy to get close to Patten." That's Chris Patten, my opponent, the Conservative Party chairman at the time. "His agent was refusing all requests for interviews and photo sessions, and wherever he went, he was surrounded by staff and security. He was always in a hurry and his schedules were elusive. The only way reporters could get relatively near him was by attending one of his press conferences. He gave one in Bath every afternoon on his arrival from London and tended to use them to comment on some unfinished London business. I have this morning sent the following letter to Neil Kinnock and so on. With the local news hounds, Patten was genial, almost conspiratorial, as if he shared with them some private understanding that this afternoon's routine in Bath was indeed a chore for everyone." A bit later it says, "Rebuffed by Chris Patten's tense, sleek-suited entourage, I tried my luck the next day with the Liberal Democrats. The contrast was almost cartoon-like. When I arrived at the Liberal Democrats HQ, the front door was open and I was able to wander directly into what seemed to be the nerve centre of the operation. A room full of jovial, this is all you lot, a room full of jovial t-shirted youths, busily sticking leaflets into envelopes, checking off lists of names, clipping items out of newspapers, the very stuff of volunteer electioneering. And in the corner, drinking tea out of a plastic cup, was Don Foster himself, a neat, owlish-looking man in his late 30s. I was actually in my late 40s, but thank you for that. Hello, apparently I said, have you come to help? And that was what it was about. So many people came to help me in Bath. I'm inordinately grateful to all of them. But equally getting help were people like Paul Tyler down in North Cornwall. Paul, any quick reflections on what you heard?
I wouldn't want to in any way contradict or say anything in conflict to what both Alison and Dennis were saying, but just a reminder that I think we're all very well aware of in the party, that in the end, politics is all local. And there were three elements, I think, that I was able to build on and use and put to good effect in North Cornwall, which, okay, the air war that they've been describing gives you credibility, gives you a context, makes it possible that you are going to be going someplace. But it's really the ground war that gets you over the line. So my three specials were one that we had recruited a young man from Fife as our campaign organizer, a young man called Willie Rennie, who went on to do other things, I think. Secondly, we were blessed with a Tory candidate, Sir Jerry Neal, who'd been Margaret Thatcher's PPS and was really only well known locally for saying that he didn't want to be a parish pump politician like our predecessor, John Pardoe. And his latest attempt to show that he was not interested in the local community was that, having promised to get a public inquiry into the Lowermoor water poisoning incident, which was all about everybody turning their hair green around Camelford, failed to go anywhere because he was sat upon by Michael Howard, who didn't want to get any trouble with water privatization. But those two elements were, I think, of some importance, but the third one is the absolutely critical one. And I think it's still critical for getting us over the line. However good the national campaign, however effective Des and Alison and everybody else, and I myself was involved in the national campaign in 83 and 87, so I know what it's like. But the local campaign actually has to feel local to get you over the line. And that's where I think Don and Nick Harvey would agree. Maybe Cornwall is always a bit extra different, but we had credibility in Cornwall, not so much because I'd been briefly an MP before in part of the constituency, but because we worked like hell between elections, and we had a community background of being part of that community, and therefore looked as if we were credible people to represent that community. And I think that still is a huge factor that gives us the extra edge. And there we can take advantage of the air war, but it's the ground war that wins us seats.
Don, you're muted.
Sorry about that, I should know by now. But somebody who knows all about that is another of our winners from North Devon this time in 1992, Nick Harvey. Nick, any thoughts you want to add?
Hello, everybody, and sorry about the musical chairs. I was just saying that I greatly enjoyed hearing Alison's inside count of the 92 campaign, and was keen to thank her for everything she did to make it so professional, but also Des Wilson, who gave up a couple of years of his life. The only income he had in that time was from selling his bonkbuster book, Custerdel's Soul. Other than that, he was full-time on the campaign, and it was an inspirational campaign. He and Paddy made an incredible duo. And I remember the meetings beforehand of candidates of the MPs, weekends in hotels and so on. There was a real team spirit and a real sense of optimism. I always felt that I was going to win in North Devon, but I never imagined turning up as one of only 20. And I do honestly believe that at the halfway point of the campaign, we were on course with at least twice that many to get elected. Many of those who were elected in 1997, I think, were well on course to win halfway through the 92 campaign. But then things did start to go horribly wrong. Some of that was our fault, some of it was Neil Kinnock's fault. People have referred to the Sheffield Rally. Some of it was actually John Major's fault. He campaigned very successfully, picking up particularly, as people have mentioned, on John Smith's shadow budget, which continued coming back to cause problems throughout the campaign. I had actually noticed things beginning to slip away and go slightly backwards before we even got to the Sheffield Rally, but it accelerated and got even worse after that. And we had all been sort of encouraged to put out a late tabloid newspaper the front page of which was meant to be Fred Blogg's, whatever the candidate's name was, set to win. And as we were just about to send it off to the printer, my team said, this isn't right. This doesn't feel right. This isn't really what's happening. And I gathered from talking to Paul Tyler that he and Nikki had arrived at exactly the same views. So we changed ours at the very last minute to it's neck and neck and portrayed it all very differently. And I think that may have been one of the things that just helped us slightly get over the line. And I totally agree with what Paul said. However good a national campaign, however slick it is, it remains at the end of the day a contest in constituencies. And that's why it's so important to have a strong local ground campaign, whatever the merits of the national campaign might be. The other thing, and just to say before I bow out, is that Paddy had asked Richard Home to form a last week group, and this infuriated Des. It was really the beginning of the end and the bust-up between Paddy and Des, because Des thought he should have been in charge of the last week of the campaign, and instead some of the critical decisions were made by Richard. Now, Richard went on to preside over a brilliant campaign in '97, but there's no doubt that some of the strategic calls that were made in that final weekend cost us dear. In particular, articles were placed in the Sunday newspapers talking up the possibility of a hung parliament and the posts we would demand in a coalition government, and basically pouring petrol onto a fire that we know had really cost us dearly in both 83 and 87. And I think the progress was already going backwards from the high point at the middle stage of the campaign, but there's no doubt about it. We got that last week calculation horribly wrong. But all in all, it was a good campaign. We'd come perilously close to extinction only shortly beforehand, and to emerge out of it with a creditable vote, a decent-sized parliamentary party, and really just intact in the way Dennis Kavanagh has described, what was the singular achievement.
Thanks, Nick. We've had various questions in the chat and sent separately, but Nick Harvey just mentioned the Sheffield Rally, and Andy Connell raised it in the chat earlier. And I just wondered, Dennis, if you have got any thoughts as to how significant that Sheffield Rally was. You'll have to unmute, Dennis.
Is that okay? Am I okay? Right, okay, thanks. Well, let me pour cold water on that. I did see the BBC broadcast showed it very, very briefly. And it did look very bad. It looked so arrogant, over the top, entitled to winning and that kind of thing. It wasn't, it was something that was written up a great deal. Matthew Parris at the last moment put it in the Times. I remember an article that was picked up, but I don't think it resonated much, and it wasn't picked up in focus groups and opinion polls and that kind of thing. It just looked bad among the cognoscenti. That's all I can say.
Don, you're muted.
Alison, sorry, do you share the view?
Yes, on one level, no on another. I think it didn't change anything. I think it confirmed something. And I think it confirmed because, as I mentioned, Kinnock had actually been really sheltered at press conferences. They were shut down. Nobody was allowed near him. He was really protected. This was his first big kind of outing, as it were. And it had been promoted and touted the entire week before as being the big event of the entire campaign. And they had the whole leadership team prancing out from under the bleachers. and you didn't have to watch much of a clip of this thing, but it was and I don't even know what it was from now, but Kinnock came out waving his arms saying, all right, all right, all right. And basically everybody, that's the only clip they showed. And everyone will tell you that in the room at the time, it felt exactly right. But in the clips that were used, this is the killer clip. This is part of the image building, image destroying piece. This was the killer clip for Kinnock. And so I think that it didn't change anything, but it confirmed all of those fears that were already building as to he's measuring curtains, he's trying to get in there so he can put taxes, all of the other little storylines that were already floating around. It didn't change anything. It just sort of went, oh my God, those might be right. I'm scared. And I think that it added to it just poured petrol on that fire, but it didn't actually change views, if that makes sense. I think it's a sort of slightly different take on what it meant, both to the political insider hacks, which I totally agree, we were busy obsessing it. But I do think that that clip kind of visually summed up for a lot of people what the fear was, is that he's not the person you've been seeing all campaign.
Thank you, Alison. Richard Hussey, and incidentally, we're going to keep going for about another 5 or 6 more minutes because both the speakers are happy to stay on a few minutes. If people have to leave, we'll absolutely understand. But Richard Hussey asks you, Alison, how concerned was the campaign to address the myth of the alliance giving Thatcher her majorities? This was something that Dennis touched on earlier. Give you a chance to comment yourself.
I guess I think both of Richard's questions. Hi, Richard. Nice to see you. The myth of the alliance allowing Thatcher majorities. I think that my vote tried to address it. I think it was trying not to talk about it. We spent a lot of time not talking about the alliance, not talking about the merger, not talking about the previous parties. It was kind of taboo to mention them. The only rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. The only rule of the alliance is don't talk about what happened. But I think the wasted vote tried to do that. But to Richard's second question, which is what I was really alluding to, is if we hadn't done 92, we couldn't have done 97. We were building the party towards that direction. And quite rightly, the party being very egalitarian doesn't like the idea that certain people get more resources, certain people get more benefits, certain people get more training, certain people get more time from the professional campaigners. And so it took us a while and some results to show the case could work. And without 92, we couldn't have said in 97, you know, that targeting thing we did before, we're now going to be ruthless about it. Like this is hardcore, just suck it up, people. We have to go with this. And I think that that's also to Paul's point. Paul, I absolutely agree. And that's Des's line about national campaigns if you don't have it on the shelf to buy locally. Air cover, however you want to call that, but we can screw you up. Like we can't fix it for you, but we can sure screw you up. And so Des really was truly about, we have to get out of the way and we have to give them the tools they need to sing along. Like we'll give them my partner's a jazz musician. It's like, somebody's got to give us the beat. And then we can all do our own solos and be very creative about what we're doing locally, but somebody's got to keep the beat going and somebody's got to keep us all to the tune. And I think that that's kind of what the national campaign can and should do, but letting local campaigns be the product on the shelf. And I think that Nick watching the campaign and changing that last minute headline probably did make a big difference for his campaign. And he was watching and saying, I'll chime in when I can and should, and I'll do my own thing when I have to. And I think that part of the working together and providing tools so that everybody can do that. But I think you're exactly right. I don't think Des would disagree. And I don't think the national campaign in 92 or 97 would remotely think that that's not what we were trying to do, is get out of the local campaigners' way, give them the tools they need, but whatever we do, don't blow it. And it's an important lesson and sometimes hard to follow.
I was fighting my 4th election for the 2010 election. and I certainly had to go local and not follow the national campaign lead, because the election slogan at that time was vote Liberal Democrat, vote for a change. And the last thing on earth I wanted the residents of Bath to do was to vote for a change. And one person who got the local voters to vote for him many times over was Simon Hughes. Simon, just any comments you want to make on the 92 election?
Don, thank you very much. It's really good to have heard everybody. Thank you. Yes, my comment, obviously, is somebody who had always fought Labour and not the Tories, was seeing things differently, because we were worried that Labour were gaining ground. And that was where we were watching. We had to remind people it was always between us and Labour. And we therefore had a different strategic tack from Paul and from Nick and from everybody else. I do remember thinking that it was a very well managed campaign, and Alison's right about that. I do remember thinking that it was extremely strongly led from the front, that Des absolutely led the campaign in a way that gave us a sense of professionalism. And I guess my single takeaway point, Don, would be that it left us, when those of us who came out having held our seats or won our seats, it left us feeling confident that we could do an election campaign well as a party. And it picks up what Dennis said. It was really, for me, a building block after the nightmare of the merger for successes in the future. I felt we knew how to do elections at last, and we did it in a coherent way.
Simon, thank you very much. And can I just say, we've sadly run out of time. I know it could go on for ages, but the Liberal Democrat History Group has a website. And if you want to make any comments about the 92 election or react to anything you've heard from the various speakers that we've had, please get in touch with them. And if they're going to follow this up, and write something more definitive about the 1992 election, then maybe you will appear in that. So please send in your comments. It just remains for me, first of all, to thank the group for facilitating this, and to all of the team there, Duncan and Neil in particular. Thank them enormously for making it happen. But above it all, I want to say a huge thank you to Dennis and to Alison for their very significant contributions, their very thoughtful remarks about the election. And to Alison, a personal thank you from me for running a campaign that helped me get elected. So thank you very much to both of them. Now, there is a facility, you can all clap online, or you can just say thank you very much in the usual way. Thank you all very much indeed. Look out for the next meeting of the group. You'll find that on the website. Thank you all very much, and good night to one and all. Thank you.